Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the most brutal jobs in medieval history, standing guard at a castle gatehouse during winter. Picture yourself right now wrapped in whatever warmth you can find and imagine trading that comfort for a stone tower where your breath freezes in the air and the wind cuts through gaps in the walls like invisible knives. You're about to discover how medieval gatehouse guards survived nights that regularly turned grown men into icicles, and honestly, you probably won't survive this without developing a deep appreciation for central heating. The medieval gatehouse wasn't just cold, it was a carefully designed death trap that happened to keep enemies out. These weren't cozy guard posts with little fireplaces and comfortable chairs. They were strategic nightmares built from massive stone blocks positioned to catch every possible draft and engineered to prioritize defense over human survival. When winter arrived, these structures became something between a fortress and a freezer, and the guards inside had to fight two enemies simultaneously, invaders who might never come and cold that definitely would. You're settling into a world where room temperature meant whatever temperature the room happened to be, which in a gatehouse during January could easily drop below freezing. The thick stone walls that kept arrows out also kept warmth from staying in. Every surface radiated cold like a malevolent presence, and the narrow windows designed to give archers good shooting angles also created perfect wind tunnels that could freeze a man's blood in his veins. But here's what makes this story fascinating. These guards didn't just endure. They developed survival techniques so ingenious they'd make modern survival experts jealous. They turned architectural nightmares into livable spaces through pure human ingenuity, creating warmth where none should exist and finding comfort in the most uncomfortable places imaginable. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below with where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how this community spans the globe, all of us united by curiosity about how people live through experiences we can barely imagine. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the entrance of a medieval gatehouse on a February night in 1347, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the sound. The wind doesn't just blow around these structures, it screams. Stone amplifies and focuses every gust, turning gentle breezes into howling banshees that seem to find every crack, every joint, every imperfection in the masonry. The gatehouse groans under the assault timber beams creaking like ship masts in a storm, and you realize this isn't just a building, it's a living thing locked in perpetual battle with the elements. The architecture tells the story of priorities. These gatehouses were built during an era when dying gloriously in battle was preferable to dying slowly from pneumonia. So comfort took a distant second place to military function. The walls averaged 3 to 6 feet thick, creating thermal mass that absorbed cold during the day and radiated it back at night like a stone refrigerator. Murder holes in the ceiling designed to drop boiling oil on attackers also created perfect chimneys for any heat to escape upward and out of the building. Your feet are already going numb on the stone floor, even through thick leather boots and wool stockings. The flagstones seem to suck warmth directly from your body each step, a small transaction where you trade precious heat for the privilege of standing upright. Medieval chroniclers wrote about gatehouse floors so cold they could freeze water solid within an hour, and guards who spent entire shifts shuffling in place, never allowing their feet to remain still long enough for the stone to steal the last of their circulation. The gatehouse itself was a masterpiece of unintentional torture, and whoever designed these things clearly never had to spend a winter night inside one. You're looking at structures that combine the worst aspects of medieval architecture into a perfect storm of human misery. The typical gatehouse rose 3 to 4 stories high, with each level designed to funnel cold air in increasingly creative ways. Ground level housed the actual gate mechanism and portcullis, creating a wind tunnel effect that turned every breeze into a miniature hurricane. The second floor usually contained the guard quarters, positioned directly in the path of rising cold air from below and falling cold air from above. But here's where medieval engineering really showed its cruel genius. These structures were built with deliberate gaps and openings that served military purposes but made human habitation nearly impossible. Arrow loops weren't just narrow windows. They were precisely angled, cold air injection systems that could create localized frost zones around sleeping areas. The slots were wide enough inside to allow an archer room to draw a bow, but narrow enough outside to prevent enemy arrows from entering. Unfortunately, this design also created a venturi effect, accelerating any outside wind and blasting it directly into the interior spaces at speeds that could extinguish candles and numb exposed skin in minutes. The walls themselves were another nightmare. Medieval masons used a technique called rubble core construction, where they built 2 outer walls of dressed stone and filled the gap between with loose rock and mortar. This created incredibly strong defensive walls, but also natural refrigeration systems. Cold air would infiltrate through tiny gaps in the outer wall, circulate through the rubble core and emerge from cracks in the inner wall, like an ancient air conditioning system designed by someone who hated comfort. You're examining the murder holes above your head, those innocent-looking openings in the stone ceiling that were designed to rain death on attackers below. In winter, these became thermal chimneys that sucked any warm air straight up and out of the building. The same openings that allowed defenders to pour boiling oil on enemies also allowed precious heat to escape into the night sky. Guards learned to stuff these holes with rags, straw or wooden plugs during the coldest months, but doing so meant sacrificing one of their primary defensive advantages. The floor construction was equally hostile to human comfort. Massive stone flags were laid directly on packed earth or rock foundations, creating an enormous heat sink that absorbed body warmth and radiated cold upward. These floors were built to last centuries and withstand the weight of heavy siege equipment, but they also created surfaces so cold that guards could develop frostbite through their boots during extended watches. Some chroniclers describe guards who placed wooden planks or straw mats over the stone, but these materials were often prohibited because they could be kicked aside during combat or create fire hazards near braziers. The window situation was particularly diabolical. Beyond the arrow loops, larger windows were fitted with wooden shutters, but no glass being a luxury that few military installations could justify. These shutters had to remain partially open during guard duty to maintain visibility and allow for defensive actions. The result was a constant stream of cold air that made the interior temperature only marginally warmer than the outside air. Guards developed techniques for positioning themselves to avoid direct exposure to these drafts, but the gatehouse's compact design meant that cold air ricocheted off stone surfaces and found every corner of the interior space. The ceiling construction added another layer of misery. Most gatehouses featured stone vaulting that created impressive architectural spaces, but also perfect acoustic chambers for amplifying wind noise. The curved stone surfaces that looked so elegant from below actually served as sound collectors that gathered every whistle, moan, and howl of winter weather, and concentrated it into the living spaces below. Guards often reported that the psychological effect of constant wind noise was almost as difficult to endure as the physical cold itself. Medieval builders occasionally attempted to address these thermal nightmares through architectural modifications. Some gatehouses featured small side chambers called guard robes, essentially built-in closets that guards could retreat into during the worst weather. These tiny spaces, barely large enough for one person to stand upright, could retain body heat more effectively than the main chambers. However, they also created claustrophobic conditions that made long-term occupation psychologically challenging. The staircase systems within gatehouses presented their own unique challenges. These spiral stone stairs, typically built in a clockwise direction, to disadvantage right-handed attackers, also created vertical wind tunnels that carried cold air from lower levels to upper chambers. Guards moving between floors experienced dramatic temperature changes that could shock their systems and increase susceptibility to illness. The narrow stone steps, worn smooth by countless footsteps, became treacherously slippery when frost formed on their surfaces. Historians still argue whether the architects of these gatehouses understood the thermal properties of their designs, or whether they simply accepted that defending a castle required sacrificing human comfort entirely. Some evidence suggests that later medieval builders tried to address the cold problem by adding internal partitions and smaller chambers, but these modifications were often inadequate against the fundamental physics of massive stone structures in freezing climates. The irony wasn't lost on medieval observers that structures designed to protect human life could be so hostile to human survival during winter months. Now you're discovering the ingenious system that kept gatehouse guards alive through the night, a carefully choreographed dance between sleep and survival that medieval defenders perfected through generations of frozen trial and error. This wasn't some formal military protocol written in manuals. It was desperate innovation, born from the simple reality that dead guards couldn't defend anything. The watch rotation system that emerged was part survival strategy, part communal heating arrangement, and part psychological warfare against the cold itself. The basic principle was brutally simple: never let everyone sleep at the same time and never let anyone sleep alone. A typical gatehouse guard unit consisted of 6 to 8 men during winter months specifically, because this number allowed for overlapping shifts that maintained both security and warmth production. 2 men would take active watch duty walking the perimeter and monitoring approaches, while 2 more would tend the fires and perform maintenance tasks that kept their bodies moving and blood circulating. The remaining guards would attempt to sleep, but even sleep became a strategic activity that required coordination and planning. Here's where it gets fascinating. Medieval guards discovered that sleeping in shifts wasn't just about staying alert, it was about staying alive. The men designated for sleep would arrange themselves in what chroniclers called human kindling, essentially using their bodies as mutual heating systems. 2 or 3 guards would share a single sleeping area, positioning themselves to maximize shared body heat, while still allowing the sleepers to respond quickly to alarms. The guards on duty had responsibility not just for external threats, but for monitoring their sleeping comrades for signs of hypothermia or excessive shivering that indicated body temperature dropping to dangerous levels. The rotation schedule followed the natural rhythm of medieval timekeeping, which divided the night into watches based on prayer times rather than precise hours. First watch began at sunset and lasted until the bells rang for Compline, roughly 3 hours. Second watch extended from Compline to Matins another 3 to 4 hours depending on the season. Third watch carried from Matins until Lauds, and the final watch brought everyone to sunrise and prime. Each rotation involved complex negotiations about who would take which shift, because different watches presented different survival challenges. The middle watches, those deep, cold hours between midnight and dawn, were considered the most dangerous, not just militarily, but physiologically. Human body temperature naturally drops during these hours, making guards more susceptible to hypothermia and frostbite. Experienced guards developed informal ranking systems that determined who got the death watches and who received the relatively warmer evening or morning shifts. New recruits invariably found themselves assigned to the brutal midnight rotations, while veterans used seniority to claim the slightly less deadly time slots. But here's the truly clever part. Guards learned to stagger their sleep cycles so that the warmest bodies were always available to rewarm their coldest comrades. A guard coming off a walking patrol, his body heated from movement and activity, would immediately take his place among the sleepers, providing crucial warmth to men whose body temperatures had dropped during rest. Meanwhile, the coldest sleeper would be awakened and assigned light duty near the braziers, allowing his core temperature to rise before taking more demanding watch responsibilities. Historians still argue whether these rotation systems were developed through formal military training or emerged organically from trial and error, but the evidence suggests they evolved naturally as guards discovered what worked and what killed people. Chronicle accounts describe gatehouse commanders who could tell at a glance whether their rotation schedules were effective based on morning casualty reports. Too many men reporting frostbite or exhaustion meant the shifts needed adjustment. The psychological aspects of these rotations were just as important as the physical ones. Medieval guards understood that isolation bred panic, and panic bred mistakes that could prove fatal in freezing conditions. By ensuring that no one faced the worst hours alone, the rotation system provided crucial mental support that helped guards maintain focus and morale through the darkest, coldest parts of the night. Sleep quality during these rotations was necessarily poor, but guards learned to value any rest as precious recovery time. They developed techniques for falling asleep quickly in uncomfortable conditions and waking instantly when their shifts began. Veterans could reportedly transition from deep sleep to full alertness in seconds, a skill that meant the difference between effective guard duty and catastrophic vulnerability to both enemies and cold. The fire was everything in a medieval gatehouse, not just a source of warmth, but the difference between life and death. And every guard understood that their survival depended on winning a nightly battle against windstone and the fundamental physics of combustion. You're looking at a war fought with kindling and determination, where losing meant more than discomfort. It meant watching your comrades freeze solid before dawn. Medieval guards didn't just tend fires, they became fire warriors, developing techniques and strategies that would make modern survival experts weep with admiration. The primary enemy wasn't just cold, it was the gatehouse itself, specifically designed to extinguish any flame through architectural malice. Those arrow loops that provided defensive advantages also created wind tunnels that could snuff out fires with surgical precision. Guards learned to read air currents like battlefield commanders studying terrain, positioning their braziers and fire pits in locations that offered maximum protection from drafts, while still providing adequate light for defensive duties. This often meant placing fires in corners where stone walls could block wind from two directions, even though corner placement reduced the fire's heating effectiveness. Medieval guards developed an entire science around fire construction that went far beyond simply throwing wood into a pile and lighting it. They learned that different types of wood burned with different characteristics crucial for survival in stone environments. Oak burned hot and long, but required intense initial heat to ignite properly. Birch caught fire quickly and provided immediate warmth, but burned through supplies rapidly. Pine and other resinous woods created bright flames, excellent for visibility, but produced smoke that could reveal defensive positions to enemies while simultaneously choking the guards themselves. The most ingenious innovation was the development of what guards called sleeping fires, carefully constructed arrangements that could provide heat throughout the night without constant attention. These fires used a base of heavy hardwood logs arranged to burn slowly and steadily, topped with lighter kindling that provided immediate flame and warmth. Guards would bank these fires with ash and carefully arranged fuel that would burn for hours without human intervention, creating heating systems that could keep men alive even when everyone was too exhausted to maintain constant fire duty. But maintaining fires in gatehouses required more than just wood selection. It demanded constant tactical thinking. Guards had to balance light discipline with warmth requirements, because fires that provided adequate heat also created visibility that could attract enemy attention or reveal defensive weaknesses. They developed techniques for creating dark fires, using arrangements of coals and carefully positioned fuel that provided maximum heat with minimum visible flame. These fires were harder to maintain and required more skill, but they offered crucial tactical advantages during periods of heightened military tension. The fuel supply situation created another layer of complexity in the fire wars. Gatehouse garrisons couldn't simply send men into the countryside to gather firewood whenever supplies ran low. That would compromise defensive readiness and expose guards to enemy action. Instead, they relied on carefully planned fuel stockpiles that had to last through entire winter seasons. Guards became expert at calculating burn rates and stretching limited supplies through techniques like fuel mixing, where they combined different types of combustible materials to achieve maximum heating efficiency from minimal resources. Historians still argue whether medieval military engineers understood the thermal dynamics they were creating when they designed gatehouses, but the evidence suggests that guards had to solve problems that architects never considered. Some gatehouse designs included purpose-built fire alcoves with stone chimneys designed to draw smoke away while retaining heat, but these features were rare luxuries that most guards never enjoyed. The social dynamics around fire maintenance created informal hierarchies within guard units. The most experienced fire tenders held positions of crucial importance because their skills could literally determine who lived through the night. New guards were assigned basic fire duties, like gathering kindling and feeding established fires, while veterans handled the complex tasks of fire placement, fuel selection, and overnight banking techniques that required years of experience to master properly. Emergency fire protocols became essential knowledge that every guard had to master. When fires died unexpectedly, whether from sudden wind gusts, fuel exhaustion, or accidental extinguishing, guards had to restart heating systems quickly, using minimal resources. They carried flint and steel as essential survival equipment, along with carefully prepared tinder that could catch sparks even in freezing humid conditions. The fastest fire starters were revered within gatehouse communities because their skills could save lives during critical moments when cold threatened to overwhelm defensive positions. You're about to discover how medieval guards turned clothing into armor against death itself, because in a gatehouse during winter, every piece of fabric became a critical component in an elaborate survival system. This wasn't fashion, this was engineering, where each layer served a specific function in keeping human bodies operational in conditions that should have killed them. Medieval guards developed layering techniques so sophisticated that modern outdoor gear companies would study their methods with genuine respect if they could travel back in time to witness the ingenuity born from pure desperation. The foundation layer was always linen worn directly against the skin, despite the common misconception that medieval people avoided bathing or clean clothes. Guards understood that linen wicking moisture away from the body better than any other available material, and moisture was the enemy of warmth. Wet skin lost heat 25 times faster than dry skin, so keeping the base layer dry could mean the difference between functional fingers and frostbitten stumps. This linen underwear was changed regularly when possible because dirty fabric lost its moisture-wicking properties and could actually trap cold dampness against the skin. Over the linen came the wool layers, multiple tunics and hose designed to trap air while maintaining mobility. Medieval guards discovered the insulation principles that wouldn't be formally understood by science for centuries. Dead air space was the key to thermal protection. They wore loose-fitting woolen garments that created pockets of warm air heated by body temperature, then trapped that air using progressively tighter outer layers. A typical guard might wear 3 or 4 woolen tunics of increasing thickness, each serving a specific function in the thermal protection system. The outer shell was usually leather or heavy wool treated with animal fat to make it wind and water resistant. This wasn't just practical, it was survival technology that guards modified and improved through constant experimentation. They learned to treat leather with specific combinations of tallow and beeswax that maintained flexibility in freezing temperatures while providing windproof protection. Some guards developed personal recipes for leather treatment that they guarded as jealously as family secrets, because superior weather protection could determine survival odds during the worst storms. Leg protection presented unique challenges because guards needed mobility for defensive duties, while maintaining warmth in extremities most vulnerable to frostbite. They wore multiple layers of wool hose, often with leather patches on the knees and seat areas that received the most wear. Over these came leather leggings or chausses that provided wind protection while allowing the full range of movement necessary for combat readiness. Guards learned to stuff extra wool or straw into their leg coverings during the coldest nights, creating additional insulation that could be removed quickly if rapid movement became necessary. Foot warmth was literally a matter of life and death, because frostbitten feet meant a guard couldn't walk his post or respond to threats effectively. Medieval guards wore multiple layers of wool stockings inside leather boots, but they also developed more creative solutions. Some stuffed their boots with straw that they changed daily, creating renewable insulation that could be adjusted based on temperature conditions. Others used animal fur linings, rabbit, squirrel, or sheepskin that provided both insulation and moisture management. Hand protection was perhaps the most critical challenge, because guards needed finger dexterity to operate weapons while preventing frostbite in the extremities most vulnerable to cold damage. They wore thin leather gloves under heavier mittens, but developed techniques for rapid glove removal that allowed immediate access to weapons when threats appeared. Some guards used a system of layered hand coverings connected by leather thongs, so they could drop their mittens without losing them while maintaining some protection on their hands. Historians still argue whether medieval guards truly understood the science behind their layering techniques, or whether they developed effective systems through trial and error guided by survival necessity. The evidence suggests a combination. Experienced guards passed down knowledge about effective combinations, but individual soldiers continued experimenting and improving techniques based on personal experience and local conditions. Head covering was another area where guards showed remarkable innovation. They wore wool caps under mail coifs or leather helmets, but also developed techniques for protecting the face and neck areas most vulnerable to frostbite. Some guards used wool scarves or face wraps that could be adjusted quickly to balance protection with visibility requirements. Others created improvised face masks from scraps of leather or fabric that provided wind protection, while maintaining the ability to communicate and observe their surroundings effectively. The social aspects of clothing maintenance created important bonds within guard units. Soldiers shared techniques for gear modification, helped each other with clothing repairs that were difficult to perform alone, and sometimes shared specialized garments when individual guards faced equipment failures. A guard whose boots developed leaks might receive temporary loans of extra stockings or foot wraps from comrades, because everyone understood that one member's equipment failure could compromise the entire unit's effectiveness. You're about to witness the most intimate survival strategy in the medieval gatehouse, the art of shared body heat, where personal boundaries dissolved in the face of mortal cold and grown warriors became human heating systems for each other. This wasn't about comfort or companionship. This was about basic thermodynamics applied to human survival, where the difference between sleeping alone and sleeping together was literally the difference between waking up and never waking up again. Medieval guards developed communal warming techniques that would make modern survivalists nod with grim recognition. The science was brutally simple. The human body produces approximately 100 watts of heat at rest, roughly equivalent to a bright light bulb. One body in a stone chamber might as well be a candle in a cathedral, completely inadequate against the thermal mass of freezing stone walls. But two bodies together could maintain a pocket of survivable warmth. 3 bodies could create genuine comfort, and 4 or more guards sharing sleeping space could actually achieve temperatures that felt luxurious by gatehouse standards. Medieval guards learned to think of their bodies as fuel for a collective heating system. The sleeping arrangements that developed were carefully orchestrated for maximum thermal efficiency. Guards would arrange themselves in what they called the chain, where each man positioned himself to share warmth with 2 others while minimizing heat loss to the stone surfaces around them. The largest, warmest guards were positioned on the outside edges, where they could provide maximum heat protection for smaller or weaker comrades. The arrangement looked like a human puzzle designed by someone who understood that survival trumped personal comfort every single time. But here's where it gets really ingenious. Guards developed rotation systems even within their shared sleeping arrangements. The men on the outside edges of the sleeping group would gradually become colder as they provided thermal protection for those in the centre. Every hour or so, the guards would carefully rearrange themselves so that the coldest members moved to the protected interior positions, while the warmed men moved to the edges. This rotation ensured that no one guard suffered excessive heat loss, while maintaining the overall warmth of the group. Personal space became a luxury that guards simply couldn't afford during the coldest months. Men who might normally maintain careful social distances found themselves pressed together, sharing breath, body heat, and sometimes even clothing. Guards learned to sleep in positions that maximize surface contact while still allowing rapid response to alarms or threats. They developed techniques for moving as a unit when everyone needed to wake quickly, minimizing the disruption to shared warmth while maintaining military readiness. The psychological adjustments required for this level of physical intimacy created strong bonds within guard units, but also occasionally led to conflicts. Men from different social backgrounds or regions had to overcome cultural taboos about personal contact, while personality conflicts had to be suppressed in favor of survival necessity. Some historical accounts describe guard units that functioned like extended families with established hierarchies and roles that governed sleeping arrangements and heat-sharing responsibilities. Clothing coordination became another aspect of communal heating strategy. Guards would share cloaks and blankets to create communal covering systems that trapped warm air around the entire group rather than individual members. They learned to arrange their outer garments to create wind barriers that protected the sleeping area from drafts, essentially building temporary shelters using nothing but the clothes they wore during the day. The most desperate situations required even more intimate warming techniques. When individual guards showed signs of severe hypothermia, uncontrollable shivering confusion or loss of coordination, their comrades would use direct skin-to-skin contact to transfer body heat and prevent death from cold exposure. This involved partially undressing the affected guard and having healthy men share direct body heat until normal temperature could be restored. These emergency warming protocols saved lives but required guards to overcome significant cultural barriers about physical contact and nudity. Historians still argue whether these communal sleeping arrangements were formal, military practices or informal adaptations that developed organically within guard units. The evidence suggests both some military manuals from the later medieval period include references to shared sleeping arrangements for winter campaigns, but most of the techniques appear to have developed through practical experience rather than official training. Morning routines had to account for the communal sleeping arrangements, with guards developing systems for awakening and preparing for duty that minimized heat loss during the vulnerable transition from sleep to active watch. They learned to keep essential gear within reach of the sleeping area, so guards could arm themselves quickly without exposing the group to excessive cold air during the clothing and equipment process. The most experienced guards could judge temperature conditions and adjust sleeping arrangements accordingly, adding or removing members from the communal sleeping area based on weather conditions and individual thermal needs. They understood that too many bodies in too small a space could create problems with air quality and mobility, while too few bodies meant inadequate heat generation for survival. You're about to discover one of the most ingenious survival technologies ever developed by medieval guards, the art of turning ordinary stones into life-saving heating systems that could provide warmth for hours using nothing but firecloth and desperate innovation. This wasn't some luxury amenity. This was cutting-edge medieval engineering that transformed rocks into portable heating units capable of keeping human bodies functional in temperatures that should have shut down circulation entirely. Guards who mastered hot stone technology often meant the difference between units that survived winter and units that were found frozen at their posts come spring. The process began with stone selection, and not just any rock would do. Guards learned through painful trial and error that different types of stone held heat for different durations and responded differently to rapid temperature changes. Sandstone was ideal because it heated evenly and retained warmth for hours, but it was often unavailable near castle sites. Granite worked well but required longer heating times and could crack explosively if heated too quickly. Limestone was common but had to be used carefully because it could crumble under extreme temperature changes, leaving guards with piles of useless rubble instead of heating stones. The heating process required careful timing and technique. Guards would select stones roughly the size of a man's head, large enough to hold substantial heat, small enough to handle safely with medieval tools. These stones were placed directly into the hottest part of brazier fires and left to heat for at least an hour, sometimes longer, depending on the stone type and desired warming duration. The stones had to reach temperatures hot enough to provide hours of warmth, but not so hot that they would burn through wrapping materials or injure the guards who handled them. Extraction from the fire was an art form that required specialized tools and techniques. Guards fashioned long-handled tongs from iron scraps or used pairs of sticks as improvised lifting devices. Some developed techniques using metal shovels or fire pokers to roll hot stones out of coals and onto stone surfaces where they could be safely wrapped. The most experienced stone handlers could gauge proper heating temperature by sound. Properly heated stones made specific hissing sounds when removed from fires, indicating they had reached optimal heat retention temperature. The wrapping technology was equally sophisticated. Guards discovered that direct contact with hot stones could cause severe burns, but improper wrapping meant rapid heat loss that made the entire process worthless. They developed multi-layer wrapping systems using whatever materials were available. The inner layer was usually old leather or thick wool that could withstand direct contact with hot stone. The middle layer consisted of additional wool or straw that provided insulation and prevented heat from escaping too quickly. The outer layer was typically canvas or leather that could be tied securely and wouldn't burn through during extended contact with the heated stone. Placement strategy required understanding human anatomy and thermal dynamics. Guards learned that hot stones were most effective when placed against major blood vessels or muscle groups that could distribute warmth throughout the body. Stones placed against the torso could warm the core and prevent hypothermia. Stones positioned at the feet could maintain circulation in extremities vulnerable to frostbite. Some guards developed techniques for using multiple stones simultaneously, creating heating networks that provided whole-body warmth throughout the night. The timing rotations for stone heating became another complex aspect of gatehouse survival routines. Stones lost heat gradually over 4 to 6 hours depending on size and wrapping effectiveness. Guards had to coordinate stone heating schedules with watch rotations to ensure that fresh hot stones were always available for guards going off duty and needing to sleep. This meant maintaining fires specifically for stone heating separate from fires needed for light and general warmth. Safety protocols developed around hot stone technology because mistakes could be catastrophic. Burns from improperly wrapped stones could disable guards when full functionality was essential for survival. Guards learned to test stone temperature through thick wrapping before placing them against their bodies. They developed techniques for gradual warming that prevented thermal shock while providing steady heat increases. Emergency procedures were established for dealing with wrapping failures that could expose sleeping guards to dangerous stone temperatures. Historians still argue whether hot stone technology was widespread among medieval military units or limited to specific regions and circumstances, but archaeological evidence suggests the practice was more common than historical records indicate. Excavations at medieval military sites have uncovered fire-cracked stones in locations that suggest systematic heating and cooling cycles consistent with portable heating applications. The social aspects of stone heating created additional layers of cooperation within guard units. Stone heating required coordination between guards tending fires and guards preparing for sleep. The process was labor-intensive enough that it demanded teamwork and advanced planning. Guards had to take turns performing the hot, dangerous work of stone preparation, while others maintained watch duties and fire maintenance responsibilities. Advanced practitioners developed techniques for extending stone heating effectiveness through careful temperature management. They learned to wrap stones in materials that could be adjusted to control heat release rates essentially, creating primitive thermostats that could provide steady warmth over extended periods. You're about to learn how medieval gatehouse guards turned food and drink into internal heating systems, because in a world where your body's furnace could mean the difference between life and death, every meal became a strategic decision about thermal management and survival. This wasn't dining. This was fuel loading, where guards developed nutritional strategies so sophisticated they essentially became human heating engineers who understood which foods burned hot, which foods burned long, and which combinations could keep their internal fires blazing through the brutal hours before dawn. The foundation of gatehouse nutrition was understanding that different foods produced different types of internal heat. Fats burned slow and steady, providing sustained warmth that could last for hours after eating. A guard who consumed a meal heavy in animal fat, bacon, cheese, or the precious beef tallow that was sometimes available, could maintain elevated body temperature throughout an entire watch shift. Proteins required more energy to digest, creating internal heat production that helped offset the calories burned by shivering and maintaining core temperature in freezing conditions. Medieval guards discovered what modern nutritionists call thermogenesis, the process by which food consumption generates internal heat through digestion and metabolism. They learned that timing their meals could create strategic warming effects that coincided with the coldest parts of their duty shifts. A guard eating a heavy fat-rich meal an hour before taking the midnight watch would experience peak digestive heat generation, just as external temperatures reached their most dangerous lows. The legendary medieval pottage wasn't just convenient cooking, it was engineered survival food that guards modified specifically for cold weather survival. Winter pottage recipes included extra animal fat root vegetables that provided sustained energy and whatever protein sources were available. Guards learned to add specific ingredients that enhanced the warming effects, onions and garlic, that stimulated circulation herbs like ginger or pepper, that created internal heat sensations, and grains that provided steady energy release throughout long cold watches. Ale and wine weren't recreational drinking. They were liquid heating systems that guards used with careful precision to maintain internal warmth without compromising judgment or reaction time. Medieval guards understood that alcohol created temporary warming sensations by dilating blood vessels and increasing circulation to skin surfaces. However, they also learned through bitter experience that excessive alcohol consumption could be fatal in cold conditions, because the same circulation effects that created warming sensations also increased heat loss through the skin. The most ingenious guards developed techniques for creating what they called warming drinks, that combined alcohol with other ingredients to maximize heating effect while minimizing impairment. Hot mulled ale mixed with honey provided quick energy and warming alcohol effects. Wine heated with spices created warming sensations that lasted longer than cold alcohol consumption. Some guards prepared heated broths with small amounts of alcohol that provided both nutrition and warming effects without the judgment impairment that could prove fatal during watch duty. Timing food consumption became another critical survival skill. Guards learned that eating immediately before sleep could interfere with the rest quality, but eating too early meant the warming effects wore off during the coldest pre-dawn hours. They developed feeding schedules that provided maximum thermal benefit during the most dangerous temperature periods while maintaining digestive comfort during sleep attempts. The social aspects of gatehouse eating created important survival bonds within guard units. Shared meals weren't just social occasions, they were survival planning sessions where guards coordinated food preparation, shared ingredients that could enhance warming effects, and ensured that individual dietary needs were met within the constraints of available supplies. Guards learned to share warming foods with comrades showing signs of cold stress, because maintaining the thermal health of the entire unit was essential for collective survival. Special foods were reserved for emergency warming situations when individual guards showed signs of dangerous hypothermia. Concentrated fats like butter or cheese could provide rapid internal heating for guards whose core temperatures had dropped to dangerous levels. Honey provided immediate energy that could fuel shivering responses necessary for generating emergency body heat. Guards maintained emergency food supplies, specifically for thermal crisis situations. Historians still argue whether medieval military rations were designed with cold weather survival in mind, or whether guards adapted standard provisions through practical experience. The evidence suggests both. Some military supply records include specific provisions for cold weather campaigns, but most thermal nutrition techniques appear to have developed through trial and error within individual guard units. Food preparation methods were modified to maximize warming potential, while working within the constraints of gatehouse cooking facilities. guards learned to prepare foods that retained heat longer, providing warming effects that extended beyond the actual eating process. Thick stews and broths could provide internal warmth that lasted for hours, while dry foods like bread and cheese provided steady energy without thermal benefits. Water management became another critical aspect of thermal nutrition. Guards had to maintain adequate hydration for health while avoiding excessive cold liquid consumption that could lower core body temperature. They developed techniques for warming water and other beverages using heated stones or proximity to fires, creating drinks that contributed to thermal management rather than detracting from it. You're about to discover how every surface angle and corner of a medieval gatehouse became part of a complex survival equation where choosing the wrong place to rest could mean the difference between waking up refreshed and never waking up at all. This wasn't interior decorating, this was tactical positioning, where guards developed an almost supernatural understanding of microclimates, heat flow patterns and thermal dynamics that could keep them alive in spaces specifically designed to kill human beings through architectural malice. The floor was the enemy, and every experienced guard knew it. Stone floors in gatehouses acted like massive heat sinks, sucking warmth directly from human bodies through conduction that could drain life-sustaining heat faster than guards could generate it. The most dangerous sleeping positions were those that maximized contact between body and stone. Lying flat on the floor was essentially surrendering to hypothermia. Guards learned to elevate themselves using whatever materials were available: straw, wooden planks, extra clothing, or even their own equipment arranged to create barriers between flesh and the thermally hostile stone surfaces. Wall positioning required understanding the complex thermal dynamics of medieval stone construction. Exterior walls were death traps that radiated cold inward like malevolent refrigeration systems. Interior walls offered slightly better thermal conditions, but still presented challenges because they connected to cold exterior structures through the stone construction. The ideal sleeping positions were those that minimized wall contact while maximizing distance from exterior surfaces. Guards learned to identify the thermal dead zones, where cold radiating from walls intersected with cold, rising from floors, creating areas where hypothermia could develop with frightening speed. Corner positioning was a double-edged survival strategy that required careful evaluation of local conditions. Corners offered protection from drafts and wind patterns that could strip heat from exposed bodies, but they also concentrated cold from two wall surfaces simultaneously. Guards developed techniques for using corners, strategically placing equipment or extra clothing against the walls to create insulation barriers while positioning their bodies to take advantage of draft protection without suffering excessive heat loss to stone surfaces. The most valuable real estate in any gatehouse was the area immediately around heat sources, but even these premium locations required strategic thinking. Too close to fires or braziers meant risk of burns, smoke inhalation, or accidental ignition of clothing and equipment. Too far meant losing the thermal benefits that could spell survival. Guards learned to identify the Goldilocks zone around each heat source close enough to benefit from radiant heating, far enough to avoid immediate dangers positioned to maximize heat capture while maintaining rapid response capability for emergencies. Elevation strategies went beyond simply getting off the floor. Guards understood that heat rises so higher, positions within gatehouse chambers offered better thermal conditions than ground-level locations. They learned to construct elevated sleeping platforms using whatever materials were available, essentially building mezzanine levels that position their bodies in warmer air layers. Some guards became expert at identifying natural elevation opportunities, stone ledges, built-in benches, or architectural features that provided height advantages without compromising defensive readiness. Air current mapping became another essential survival skill. Guards learned to read the invisible flow patterns that carried cold air through gatehouse interiors. Arrow loops created predictable draft patterns that could be mapped and avoided. Murder holes generated upward air currents that stripped heat from anything positioned beneath them. Door and window openings created circulation patterns that guards had to understand and work around. The most experienced guards could enter an unfamiliar gatehouse and quickly identify the thermal safe zones and danger areas based on architectural features and air movement patterns. Equipment positioning was integrated into sleeping strategy, because medieval guards couldn't simply leave weapons and gear unattended while they slept. They learned to arrange their equipment to serve double duty as thermal management tools. Shields could be positioned to block drafts while remaining accessible for rapid deployment. Cloaks and extra clothing could be arranged to create wind barriers while staying organized for quick dressing. Weapons had to remain within immediate reach while contributing to thermal protection systems. The timing of position selection became another tactical consideration. The best sleeping spots in any gatehouse were limited, so guards had to coordinate position assignments based on watch schedules and thermal needs. Guards coming off cold duty received priority access to the warmest positions, while guards preparing for active watches accepted less optimal thermal conditions in exchange for easier access to equipment and exit routes. Historians still argue whether medieval military training included instruction in thermal positioning techniques, or whether these skills developed organically through practical experience. The evidence suggests that while formal training may not have addressed sleeping position strategy, specifically experienced guards definitely passed down knowledge about gatehouse thermal dynamics to new recruits as essential survival information. Group positioning strategies required coordination between multiple guards sharing sleeping areas. They learned to arrange themselves to create mutual thermal protection while maintaining the ability to respond collectively to alarms or threats. This involved understanding how individual body positions affected the thermal conditions for adjacent guards and adjusting arrangements to optimize heat retention for the entire group rather than just individual members. Advanced practitioners could modify gatehouse interiors using available materials to improve thermal conditions in sleeping areas. They learned to construct temporary windbreaks using cloaks and equipment, create insulation barriers using straw and clothing, and arrange furniture or storage items to redirect air currents away from sleeping positions. You're about to learn how medieval gatehouse guards became wind warriors, developing combat techniques against an invisible enemy that could kill more efficiently than any human opponent. This wasn't just staying out of drafts. This was tactical warfare against air currents that moved like attacking armies through stone corridors, seeking exposed skin and vulnerable body heat with the precision of trained assassins. Guards who mastered wind combat lived through winters that turned less prepared defenders into frozen monuments to architectural cruelty. The enemy was invisible but predictable, and experienced guards learned to read wind patterns like military commanders studying battlefield terrain. Air moved through gatehouses in consistent flows that could be mapped, understood, and countered with the right techniques. Cold air sank and pooled in low areas, creating deadly zones where guards could literally walk into hypothermia traps. Warm air rose and escaped through any available opening, carrying precious heat away from the guards who desperately needed it. Understanding these patterns was the foundation of the wind combat strategy. Arrow loops weren't just defensive positions, they were precision wind injection systems that could create localized death zones within gatehouse chambers. Each loop generated a specific draft pattern, based on its size, orientation, and relationship to external wind conditions. Guards learned to map these patterns during different weather conditions, identifying the safe zones where they could position themselves without suffering direct wind exposure. They developed techniques for partially blocking arrow loops using cloth leather or wooden shutters that maintained some defensive capability while reducing deadly airflow. The Venturi effect was a killer that guards learned to recognize and counter. Narrow passages between chambers or around architectural features could accelerate air movement, creating wind speeds that could strip heat from exposed bodies faster than human metabolism could replace it. Guards identified these acceleration zones and learned to move through them quickly, minimizing exposure time while maintaining defensive readiness. They developed clothing and equipment arrangements that provided maximum wind protection during transit through these dangerous areas. Door and window positioning created complex air circulation patterns that guards had to understand and manipulate. Opening doors created immediate wind tunnels that could flood chambers with cold air, but completely sealed chambers could become carbon dioxide traps that were equally dangerous. Guards learned to use partial opening techniques that maintained air quality while minimizing cold air intrusion. They developed door and shutter adjustment methods that could redirect airflow away from sleeping and warming areas while maintaining defensive visibility. The thermal layering effect meant that different elevations within the same chamber experienced dramatically different wind conditions. Cold air hugged floors and concentrated in low areas, while slightly warmer air occupied higher elevations. Guards learned to position themselves vertically within chambers to take advantage of these thermal layers while remaining effective for defensive duties. They developed techniques for moving between thermal layers without creating air disturbances that would destroy the beneficial temperature gradients. Wind blocking became an advanced survival skill that involved using available materials to create strategic barriers against air movement. Guards learned to construct temporary windbreaks using cloaks, spare clothing, and equipment, arranged to deflect drafts away from critical areas. These weren't permanent modifications to gatehouse architecture. They were tactical deployments that could be quickly assembled and disassembled based on changing wind conditions and defensive requirements. Clothing configuration for wind combat went beyond simple layering to include specific arrangements designed to shed airflow while maintaining mobility. Guards learned to adjust their outer garments to create aerodynamic profiles that deflected wind rather than catching it. They developed techniques for using hoods, cloaks, and other clothing elements as personal wind barriers that could be deployed and adjusted based on local air current conditions. Body positioning techniques allowed guards to minimize wind exposure while maintaining defensive readiness. They learned to orient themselves relative to dominant air currents to reduce exposed surface area while keeping weapons accessible and vision clear. Advanced practitioners could adjust their posture and position to use their own bodies as windbreaks for comrades, creating collaborative defense strategies against air movement. Historians still argue whether medieval guards understood the scientific principles behind wind movement and thermal dynamics, or whether they developed effective techniques through practical experience without theoretical knowledge. The evidence suggests they achieved sophisticated understanding of airflow patterns through observation and experimentation, even if they couldn't explain the physics involved. Breathing techniques were adapted to cope with cold air exposure during unavoidable wind encounters. Guards learned to breathe through their noses when possible to warm incoming air, and to use clothing or improvised face coverings to pre-warm breath during extreme conditions. They developed mouth-breathing techniques that minimize lung exposure to frigid air, while maintaining the ability to communicate and respond to threats. Emergency wind protection protocols were established for situations when normal wind combat techniques proved inadequate. Guards learned to recognize the signs of dangerous wind chill conditions and had procedures for seeking emergency shelter or implementing emergency warming techniques when wind exposure threatened hypothermia or frostbite. The most experienced guards could predict wind pattern changes based on external weather conditions, allowing them to prepare for shifting air currents before they created dangerous thermal conditions. They learned to read subtle environmental indicators that warned of incoming wind pattern changes, giving them time to adjust positions and protection strategies before conditions became life-threatening. You're about to witness the desperate emergency protocols that medieval gatehouse guards developed for those terrifying moments when hypothermia began its final assault on human consciousness. Because when the cold started winning the war for a guard's life, there were specific battle-tested techniques that could pull someone back from the edge of freezing death. These weren't gentle medical procedures, they were aggressive interventions designed to restart failing body systems before irreversible damage occurred, and every guard had to master them because anyone could become the victim who needed emergency revival. The first sign of dangerous hypothermia wasn't dramatic collapse, it was the subtle loss of fine motor control that experienced guards learned to recognize in themselves and their comrades. A guard who couldn't work buckles, tie knots, or handle weapons with normal dexterity was entering the danger zone where body temperature had dropped low enough to affect brain function. Medieval guards developed quick diagnostic techniques that could assess hypothermia severity without medical instruments. They learned to check speech patterns for slurring test coordination with simple tasks, and evaluate mental alertness with questions that revealed cognitive impairment. The emergency warming protocol began with immediate isolation from further heat loss. Guards showing hypothermia symptoms were moved away from wind sources wrapped in every available layer of clothing and covering, and positioned as close to heat sources as safety permitted. But the rewarming process had to be carefully controlled. Medieval guards learned through tragic experience that rapid rewarming could be as dangerous as continued cold exposure. Sudden heat could cause dangerous blood pressure changes and cardiac problems that could kill victims who might have survived gradual warming. Direct body heat transfer became the primary emergency intervention when fires and external heat sources proved inadequate. Healthy guards would remove some of their own clothing and share direct skin-to-skin contact with hypothermia victims, using their own body heat to gradually raise the victim's core temperature. This required overcoming significant cultural barriers about nudity and physical contact, but guards understood that social taboos were less important than preventing death from cold exposure. The most desperate situations required what guards called the human furnace technique, where multiple healthy guards would sandwich a hypothermic victim between their bodies, creating a living heating system that could provide intensive warming while maintaining careful temperature control. This technique was exhausting for the healthy guards and required careful rotation to prevent the rescuers from becoming hypothermic themselves, but it could save lives when other methods failed. Breathing techniques were critical for emergency hypothermia treatment because victims often developed shallow, slow breathing that couldn't provide adequate oxygen or maintain internal heat generation. Guards learned to monitor breathing patterns and provide assisted breathing when necessary. They developed techniques for warming the air that hypothermic victims breathed using their own breath, or heated cloths to ensure that incoming air didn't further reduce core temperature. Movement therapy was another essential component of emergency warming protocols. Hypothermic guards had to be kept moving enough to maintain circulation without exhausting their remaining energy reserves. Healthy guards learned to provide assisted movement gentle exercises that stimulated blood flow and heat generation without placing excessive demands on failing body systems. The goal was to restart natural heat production mechanisms that had begun shutting down due to cold exposure. Emergency nutrition became part of hypothermia treatment, but guards learned that feeding hypothermic victims required careful technique. Cold-impaired digestive systems couldn't handle normal food quantities or types, so guards provided small amounts of easily digestible high-energy foods that could fuel internal heat generation without overwhelming compromised bodily functions. Warm liquids were ideal when available, but had to be administered gradually to prevent digestive shock. Recognition of irreversible hypothermia was another grim skill that guards had to master. They learned to identify the signs that indicated when emergency warming protocols were no longer effective and when continued efforts might endanger the healthy guards attempting rescue. This included understanding the physical indicators of severe hypothermia: rigid muscles, barely detectable pulse, and profound unconsciousness that might not respond to warming interventions. Historians still argue whether medieval guards received formal training in hypothermia treatment or developed these techniques through practical experience with cold weather casualties. The evidence suggests that while medical understanding was limited, guards developed remarkably effective emergency protocols through trial and error, guided by survival necessity. Prevention protocols were equally important because guards learned that preventing severe hypothermia was far more effective than treating it after symptoms appeared. They developed early intervention techniques that could halt developing hypothermia before it progressed to life-threatening stages. These included recognizing the early warning signs in themselves and comrades implementing immediate warming measures at the first indication of cold stress and adjusting duty assignments to protect guards showing vulnerability to cold exposure. The psychological aspects of hypothermia treatment required special attention because victims often experienced confusion, disorientation, and resistance to treatment. Guards learned to provide firm, clear direction to hypothermic comrades who might not understand the severity of their condition or cooperate with warming efforts. They developed communication techniques that could penetrate cold-induced mental impairment and motivate victims to participate in their own recovery. Recovery monitoring was the final critical component of emergency hypothermia protocols. Guards learned to assess when victims had achieved safe core temperatures and could resume normal duties versus when they needed continued observation and gradual return to full activity. They understood that hypothermia recovery was a gradual process that required ongoing attention to prevent relapse. You're about to confront the brutal mathematics of medieval gatehouse survival, where historical records reveal casualty rates that would shock modern military commanders and illuminate just how deadly winter duty truly was for guards who drew the unlucky assignment of defending castle entrances during the coldest months. These weren't abstract statistics. They were real men who froze to death at their posts, and the numbers tell a story of survival odds so grim that gatehouse duty was essentially a slow-motion death sentence that some guards survived through skill luck or sheer stubborn refusal to surrender to the cold. Winter mortality rates among gatehouse guards varied dramatically based on castle location, construction quality, and resource availability, but even the best-equipped units faced casualty rates that would be considered catastrophic by modern standards. Chronicles from northern English castles describe winter seasons where gatehouse units lost 20 to 30% of their guards to cold-related deaths, frostbite disabilities and illnesses that developed from prolonged cold exposure. These numbers didn't include guards who survived winter duty but suffered permanent damage from frostbite, lost fingers, toes, or facial features that mark them as gatehouse veterans for the rest of their lives. The most dangerous period was the deep winter months from December through February, when temperatures remained below freezing for weeks at a time, and gatehouse interiors could drop to temperatures that made human survival nearly impossible. Records from Scottish border castles show that January and February deaths among guards were 4 times higher than summer mortality, and that wasn't counting combat casualties. These were deaths directly attributed to cold illness and exposure-related conditions that developed during gatehouse duty. Geographic location played a crucial role in survival statistics. Gatehouses in coastal areas with moderating ocean influences might lose 10 to 15% of their guards during winter months, while mountain castles or those in continental climates could see mortality rates approaching 50% during particularly severe winters. The brutal winter of 1315-1316, known as the Great Famine Winter, produced gatehouse mortality rates so high that some castles had to abandon perimeter defence entirely because they lacked living guards to maintain watch schedules. Age demographics reveal another layer of the survival equation that gatehouse commanders had to manage. Guards over 40 faced mortality rates nearly double those of men in their 20s, while guards under 20 also showed elevated death rates due to inexperience with cold weather survival techniques. The optimal survival age range was roughly 25 to 35 when guards had enough experience to avoid fatal mistakes, but retained the physical resilience necessary to endure extreme cold exposure. The cause of death statistics paint a grim picture of how winter killed gatehouse guards. Hypothermia was the leading killer, accounting for roughly 40% of cold weather deaths, followed by pneumonia and other respiratory illnesses that developed from prolonged cold exposure. Frostbite-related infections killed another 15%, while accidents caused by cold-impaired judgment or coordination claimed additional lives. Some guards simply disappeared during winter storms, their bodies never recovered, adding to mortality statistics that were likely underreported. Survival rates improved dramatically with experience, but the learning curve was deadly. First-year gatehouse guards face mortality rates 3 to 4 times higher than veterans with multiple winter seasons of experience. This created a perverse selection effect where surviving guards became increasingly skilled at cold weather survival, but the human cost of training new guards remained consistently high. Military commanders learned to assign new guards to gatehouse duty only during less severe weather-saving winter assignments for experienced veterans when possible. Equipment availability showed direct correlation with survival statistics. Well-supplied gatehouses with adequate fuel food and winter clothing might lose only 5 to 10% of their guards during winter months, while poorly supplied positions could see mortality rates exceeding 30%. The difference between adequate winter supplies and insufficient resources was literally the difference between life and death for guards assigned to these positions. Historians still argue whether medieval military commanders fully understood these mortality statistics, or whether gatehouse death rates were simply accepted as inevitable costs of castle defence. Some evidence suggests that experienced commanders tried to minimize winter gatehouse casualties through better supply planning and guard rotation policies, while other records indicate that gatehouse duty was sometimes used as punishment for disciplinary problems, essentially sentencing problem guards to potentially fatal winter assignments. The economic impact of gatehouse mortality was significant enough that some castle administrators began calculating the cost of training replacement guards against the expense of providing better winter survival resources. Records from several English castles show deliberate investment in improved gatehouse heating systems and winter clothing specifically to reduce replacement costs associated with cold weather casualties. Comparative mortality data reveals that Gatehouse guards faced death rates comparable to combat soldiers during active campaigns, but spread over longer periods and caused by environmental rather than military factors. The psychological impact of these statistics affected unit morale and recruitment, as guards understood that accepting Gatehouse assignments carried substantial mortality risk that couldn't be avoided through skill or courage. Regional variations in survival techniques led to different mortality patterns across Europe. Scandinavian guards, drawing on cultural traditions of cold weather survival, showed consistently better survival rates than guards from warmer climates assigned to northern positions. This led some military commanders to recruit guards specifically based on their regional cold weather experience, essentially creating specialized units of cold weather survivors for the most dangerous Gatehouse assignments. The seasonal pattern of deaths reveals the progression of how winter killed guards over time. Early winter deaths were typically caused by accidents and acute cold exposure during sudden weather changes. Midwinter mortality peaked as accumulated cold stress overwhelmed guard physiology and depleted survival resources. Late winter deaths often resulted from illness and exhaustion, as guards weakened by months of cold exposure succumbed to diseases that healthy guards might have survived. You're about to learn about the predictable, preventable mistakes that killed new Gatehouse guards with depressing regularity, because inexperience in medieval cold weather survival wasn't just uncomfortable, it was frequently fatal, and the veterans who survived multiple winter seasons could predict which rookies would live through their first assignment and which ones would be found frozen solid come morning. These weren't complex tactical errors. They were simple, deadly misconceptions about cold weather survival that experienced guards tried desperately to correct before winter claimed another victim. The most common fatal mistake was trusting body sensations over veteran advice. New guards would feel warm during physical activity and assume they could handle cold exposure without proper preparation. They'd remove layers of clothing during active duty, believing that feeling overheated meant they were adequately protected against cold conditions. Veterans knew that the warming sensation from activity was temporary, and that guards who stripped down during warm periods would face potentially fatal cold exposure when their activity levels decreased or when weather conditions changed suddenly. Alcohol consumption was another killer that claimed rookies with predictable regularity. New guards often believed that drinking would provide internal warming that could substitute for proper clothing or positioning strategies. They'd consume ale or wine, thinking it would help them stay warm during cold watches, not understanding that alcohol created false warming sensations while actually increasing heat loss through dilated blood vessels. Veterans had learned that moderate alcohol consumption could be part of warming strategies, but excessive drinking during cold exposure was essentially suicide by hypothermia. Sleep positioning errors killed guards who hadn't yet learned to read the thermal landscape of Gatehouse interiors. Rookies would choose sleeping spots based on comfort rather than thermal safety, positioning themselves near walls that radiated cold in low areas where cold air pooled, or away from heat sources because they didn't want to compete with other guards for prime locations. Veterans knew that sleeping location was literally a matter of life and death, and they'd learned to claim thermal safe zones regardless of social dynamics or personal comfort preferences. Fire management mistakes were another category of rookie errors that could prove fatal. New guards would build fires too large, creating immediate warmth, but burning through fuel supplies that needed to last entire nights. They'd position fires incorrectly, failing to account for wind patterns that could extinguish flames, or smoke conditions that could make chambers uninhabitable. Some rookies would fall asleep too close to fires, risking burns or carbon monoxide poisoning, while others would position themselves too far away and lose critical thermal benefits. Equipment misuse represented another class of deadly rookie mistakes. New guards often wore their clothing incorrectly, creating gaps in thermal protection, or wearing layers in arrangements that trapped moisture against skin. They'd neglect a waterproof leather equipment, leading to clothing failures during wet weather. Some rookies would share equipment inappropriately, lending critical winter gear to other guards and leaving themselves vulnerable to cold exposure. The pride factor killed guards who were too embarrassed to admit they were cold sick or struggling with survival techniques. Rookies would attempt to match the endurance of experienced guards without understanding that veterans had developed specific techniques for managing cold exposure that new guards hadn't yet mastered. They'd refuse help with equipment positioning or warming techniques because they didn't want to appear weak or incompetent. Veterans knew that survival required swallowing pride and accepting assistance when conditions became dangerous. Timing errors were another rookie killer, particularly around eating, drinking, and activity scheduling. New guards would eat at wrong times, leaving themselves without internal heat generation during the coldest periods. They'd fail to coordinate their personal warming activities with watch rotations, leaving themselves unprepared for cold exposure when their duty shifts began. Some rookies would exhaust themselves during warm periods, leaving no energy reserves for generating heat during cold exposure. Breathing technique mistakes weren't obviously fatal, but they contributed to rookie mortality by increasing vulnerability to respiratory illness and reducing cold tolerance. New guards would breathe through their mouths during cold exposure, allowing frigid air to reach their lungs directly. They'd fail to warm incoming air using proper breathing techniques, increasing their susceptibility to pneumonia and other cold-related illnesses that could kill guards whose resistance had been weakened by improper breathing habits. Historians still argue whether medieval military training included specific instruction about cold weather survival, or whether rookie guards were expected to learn these techniques through observation and experience. The evidence suggests that while formal training may have covered basic survival concepts, the detailed knowledge that separated living guards from dead ones was typically passed down informally from veterans to newcomers. Social dynamics errors could also prove fatal for rookies who failed to understand the cooperation required for cold weather survival. New guards might compete rather than collaborate with other guards, failing to participate in shared warming activities or heat generation techniques. They'd neglect to monitor their comrades for signs of cold stress, missing opportunities to provide assistance that could prevent deaths. Some rookies would isolate themselves rather than accepting the physical intimacy required for shared body heat survival techniques. Resource management mistakes represented another category of potentially fatal rookie errors. New guards would consume their food supplies too quickly, leaving insufficient nutrition for maintaining internal heat generation throughout long winter nights. They'd waste fuel on inefficient fires, burn through candle supplies for unnecessary light, or fail to maintain equipment that could become critical for survival during extreme weather conditions. The overconfidence factor claimed guards who assumed that surviving one cold night meant they'd mastered winter survival techniques. These rookies would become careless with safety protocols after initial success, failing to maintain the constant vigilance required for cold weather survival. Veterans knew that cold weather survival required consistency and attention to detail that had to be maintained throughout entire winter seasons, not just during individual cold nights. You're about to discover how medieval gatehouse guards turned animals into essential partners in their war against freezing death. Because in a world where every source of warmth could mean survival, dogs, horses, cats, and even livestock became valued members of survival teams that guards protected as fiercely as they protected each other. This wasn't sentimentality. This was strategic alliance where animals provided heat, early warning systems, and psychological support that could keep human guards alive through nights that should have killed them all. Dogs were the ultimate gatehouse survival partners, and experienced guards understood that a good dog was worth more than extra blankets or additional fuel for fires. Large dogs generated substantial body heat. A big mastiff or wolfhound could produce warming equivalent to a small brazier, but with the added advantage of being mobile responsive and capable of adjusting position to provide optimal heat distribution. Guards learned to sleep with dogs pressed against their bodies using canine body heat to maintain core temperature during the coldest hours, when human heat generation alone proved insufficient. The symbiotic relationship between guards and dogs went beyond simple warmth sharing. Dogs served as early warning systems that could detect intruders, weather changes, or dangerous conditions that might threaten sleeping guards. A dog's superior hearing could identify approaching threats long before human guards became aware of danger, providing crucial response time that could save lives during emergencies. Dogs also served as psychological anchors during the long, dark, terrifying hours when isolation and cold combined to create mental stress that could impair judgment and survival decision-making. Horses provided different but equally valuable survival advantages for gatehouse guards. The enormous body mass of a horse generated substantial heat that could warm entire areas of stables or lower chambers where guards might seek shelter during the worst weather. Guards learned to position themselves near horses without disturbing the animals, using equine body heat as massive living radiators that could provide warmth throughout entire nights. Horse blankets and tack could be borrowed for human use during emergencies, providing additional insulation and wind protection. Cats offered unique survival advantages that made them prized residents of gatehouse communities. Beyond their obvious rodent control functions that protected food supplies, cats were exceptional at finding the warmest spots in any building. Guards learned to observe cat behavior as indicators of optimal thermal conditions. Wherever cats chose to sleep was likely the warmest, most protected area available. Cats also provided psychological comfort during the isolation and stress of winter duty, offering companionship that helped maintain mental health during the darkest months. The most desperate survival situations led to more creative animal partnerships. Guards sometimes shared quarters with chickens, pigs, or goats, when these animals were available, using livestock body heat for emergency warming. These arrangements required careful management to balance warmth benefits against hygiene problems and space constraints. But desperate guards learned that animal heat could provide crucial thermal support when human heat generation proved inadequate. Animal care became a survival priority because guards understood that healthy animals provided better thermal benefits than sick or weak ones. They shared food with their animal partners, provided basic veterinary care, and protected animals from cold exposure that could reduce their heat generation capacity. Guards learned to maintain animal health, not just from compassion, but from practical understanding that animal survival was directly linked to human survival during winter conditions. The positioning strategies for animal heat sharing required understanding animal behavior and comfort requirements. Dogs needed to feel secure and protected before they would settle into positions optimal for heat sharing with humans. Horses required careful approach techniques that wouldn't startle them or create safety hazards for guards seeking warmth near large, powerful animals. Guards developed techniques for arranging sleeping areas that maximized heat benefits while maintaining safety and comfort for both humans and animals. Feeding strategies had to account for the increased caloric needs of animals providing heat for human partners. Dogs working as heating partners required additional food to fuel their heat generation, while horses needed extra fodder to maintain body mass and thermal output. Guards learned to balance their limited food resources between human nutrition needs and animal care requirements, understanding that well-fed animals provided better survival support. Historians still argue whether the use of animals for survival warmth was widespread among medieval military units, or limited to specific circumstances and locations. Archaeological evidence suggests that animal-human cohabitation was common at military sites, but determining whether this was primarily for survival purposes versus practical convenience remains challenging based on available historical records. The social dynamics of animal partnerships created interesting hierarchies within gatehouse communities. The best survival dogs were valuable enough that their ownership and care arrangements required negotiation and cooperation among guards. Some animals developed relationships with specific guards, while others functioned as community resources shared among entire units. Guards learned to respect these animal partnerships because disrupting them could compromise survival arrangements for multiple people. Emergency protocols existed for situations when animals became ill-injured or unable to provide their usual survival support. Guards had to have backup heating arrangements that didn't depend on animal partners, because losing animal heat sources during critical cold periods could create survival emergencies. They also developed techniques for providing emergency care to animals whose health was essential for human survival. Advanced practitioners learned to train animals specifically for cold weather survival support. Dogs could be taught to seek optimal sleeping positions, respond to commands for heat-sharing arrangements, and provide specific services like retrieving equipment or alerting guards to temperature changes. These trained animals became incredibly valuable assets that guards protected and cared for as essential survival equipment. You're about to explore the psychological battlefield that raged inside the minds of medieval gatehouse guards, because surviving months of brutal cold required more than physical techniques. It demanded mental strategies that could prevent despair, panic, and the psychological breakdown that killed guards just as effectively as hypothermia. This was warfare against the human mind's tendency to surrender when faced with seemingly impossible conditions, and the guards who survived developed mental survival techniques that would impress modern psychologists with their sophistication and effectiveness. The isolation was perhaps the most dangerous psychological enemy that guards faced during winter duty. Unlike summer campaigns where guards might interact with travelers, merchants, or messengers, winter gatehouse duty meant weeks or months with the same small group of men trapped in stone chambers with no external stimulation or variety. Guards learned that isolation could drive men to dangerous behaviors, reckless risk-taking abandonment of safety protocols, or complete psychological withdrawal that left them unable to perform essential survival activities. Mental counting techniques became essential tools for maintaining psychological stability during the endless dark hours when time seemed to stop and despair threatened to overwhelm rational thinking. Guards developed elaborate counting systems that served multiple purposes, tracking time passage, maintaining mental activity, and providing psychological anchors that kept their minds engaged with concrete tasks rather than dwelling on cold discomfort and fear. Some guards counted heartbeats, others counted breaths, while advanced practitioners developed complex numerical sequences that required sustained mental effort. Storytelling served as both entertainment and psychological survival strategy, because shared narratives created mental escapes from immediate physical discomfort while building social bonds that helped guards support each other through the worst conditions. Guards developed repertoires of stories, songs, and recitations that could fill hours of dark, cold time with mental activity that distracted from physical suffering. The best storytellers were valued not just for entertainment, but for their ability to maintain unit morale during psychological crisis periods. Memory exercises became another crucial mental survival technique that guards used to maintain cognitive function during extreme cold exposure. Cold affected mental clarity and memory formation, so guards learned to exercise their minds deliberately to maintain sharp thinking essential for survival decision-making. They practiced reciting prayers, poems, or lists of information that required mental effort and helped preserve cognitive abilities that cold exposure could impair. Religious and spiritual practices provided psychological anchors that helped guards maintain hope and purpose during conditions that could easily lead to despair and surrender. Prayer, meditation, and spiritual reflection offered mental activities that didn't require physical energy, while providing psychological comfort and meaning that helped guards endure suffering that might otherwise seem pointless. Guards learned to use spiritual practices as mental warming techniques that provided psychological heat when physical warmth was unavailable. Goal-setting techniques helped guards maintain motivation and forward thinking during present conditions that seemed endless and hopeless. They learned to break winter survival into manageable psychological segments, surviving until the next meal lasting, through one more watch making it to the next supply delivery. These intermediate goals provided psychological milestones that made long-term survival seem achievable rather than impossible. The management of fear required specific psychological techniques because uncontrolled fear could lead to panic behaviors that compromise survival decision-making. Guards learned to acknowledge fear without allowing it to overwhelm rational thinking, using breathing techniques, mental exercises, and social support to maintain emotional control during crisis situations. They developed ways to channel fear into productive survival energy rather than allowing it to become paralyzing anxiety. Social psychology played a crucial role in guard unit survival because the mental health of individual guards affected the survival chances of entire groups. Guards learned to monitor each other for signs of psychological breakdown, withdrawal, irrational behavior, or loss of survival, motivation, and developed intervention techniques that could help struggling comrades maintain psychological stability. These weren't formal counseling methods, but practical peer support techniques that could prevent psychological casualties. Historians still argue whether medieval guards understood the psychological aspects of survival, or whether they developed effective mental techniques through practical experience without theoretical knowledge. The evidence suggests they achieved sophisticated understanding of psychological survival needs through observation and experimentation, even if they couldn't explain the mental health principles involved. Humor and levity served as essential psychological survival tools that guards used to maintain morale and group cohesion during conditions that could easily lead to despair and conflict. They learned to find absurdity and comedy in their miserable conditions, using laughter as a weapon against the psychological effects of cold isolation and fear. The ability to maintain humor during extreme adversity became a marker of experienced guards who'd learned to survive psychologically as well as physically. Mental preparation techniques helped guards develop psychological resilience before facing the worst winter conditions. Experienced guards learned to prepare mentally for extended cold exposure by developing realistic expectations, practicing mental exercises, and building psychological resources that could sustain them through predictable periods of extreme hardship. This mental preparation was as important as physical preparation for guards who expected to survive entire winter seasons. The development of personal rituals and routines provided psychological structure that helped guards maintain mental stability during chaotic and unpredictable survival conditions. These routines offered psychological comfort and predictability that helped guards feel some sense of control over their environment, even when physical conditions remained largely beyond their influence. Personal rituals became anchors that helped maintain psychological equilibrium during extreme stress. You're about to witness the resurrection rituals that transformed half-dead guards into functional human beings each morning, because surviving the night was only half the battle. Guards who made it through brutal Gatehouse winters still faced the monumental challenge of bringing their frozen, exhausted bodies back to operational status when dawn finally arrived. This wasn't simply waking up. This was a careful process of restarting human systems that had been pushed to the very edge of survival, and the guards who mastered these revival techniques were the ones who could repeat the cycle night after night without permanent damage. The awakening process began before guards were fully conscious, because experienced veterans learned that the transition from sleep to wakefulness in extreme cold required gradual, careful management to prevent shock to systems that had been operating in survival mode throughout the night. Guards developed techniques for slow awakening that allowed their bodies to adjust gradually to increased activity demands, while still maintaining whatever warmth they had preserved during sleep. Sudden movement or rapid awakening could cause dangerous blood pressure changes and circulation problems in bodies that had been operating at minimal function levels. Circulation restoration was the first critical priority, because guards typically woke with severely restricted blood flow to hands, feet, and other extremities that had been sacrificed to maintain core temperature during the night. They learned to begin with gentle, controlled movements that gradually encouraged blood flow without creating painful circulation, rushing, or dangerous pressure changes. Simple finger and toe exercises performed slowly and deliberately could restart circulation that had been nearly shut down during sleep. The breathing revival techniques that guards developed were essential for transitioning from the shallow conservation breathing of sleep to the deeper respiration required for active duty. Cold air made normal breathing difficult and potentially dangerous, so guards learned to gradually increase their respiratory rate and depth, using controlled techniques that warmed incoming air while avoiding lung shock from sudden exposure to frigid conditions. They developed methods for warming their first breaths of the day using body heat or exhaled air recirculation. Joint mobility restoration required specific attention, because cold exposure during sleep could leave guards with severely stiffened joints that wouldn't respond normally to movement commands. They learned to work systematically through major joint groups, shoulders, elbows, hips, knees, using gentle range-of-the-motion exercises that gradually restored flexibility without causing injury to joints that had been locked in survival positions throughout the night. This process could take 15 to 20 minutes before guards achieved normal mobility. Mental awakening was just as important as physical revival, because cold exposure affected cognitive function and decision-making ability that guards needed to recover quickly for effective duty performance. They developed mental exercises that helped restore alertness and clarity memory challenges, counting exercises or recitations that required focused mental effort. Guards learned that mental sharpness couldn't be taken for granted after nights of extreme cold exposure. The warming progression had to be carefully controlled because rapid rewarming could be as dangerous as continued cold exposure. Guards learned to gradually increase their body temperature using techniques that avoided thermal shock while steadily moving toward normal operating temperature. This often involved moving progressively closer to heat sources, adding layers of clothing systematically, and engaging in increasing levels of physical activity that generated internal heat without overwhelming systems that had been operating in conservation mode. Nutrition timing became another critical aspect of morning revival because guards needed to refuel their body's heating systems Without overwhelming digestive systems that had been operating minimally during cold sleep, they learned to start with small amounts of easily digestible high-energy foods that could provide quick fuel for heat generation and increased activity. Hot liquids were ideal when available, but had to be consumed gradually to avoid digestive shock. Equipment preparation was integrated into the revival process, because guards had to restore their gear to operational status while simultaneously bringing their own bodies back to functional condition. Weapons needed to be checked for frost damage or ice formation that could affect performance. Clothing had to be adjusted, rearranged, or dried to provide optimal protection for the coming day. This equipment maintenance had to be performed with hands and minds that were still recovering from cold exposure. Coordination testing became an important part of the revival routine because guards needed to verify that their motor skills and reflexes had returned to levels adequate for defensive duties. They developed simple tests that could quickly assess whether they had recovered sufficient coordination and reaction time to perform essential guard functions safely and effectively. Guards who failed these self-assessments needed additional recovery time before taking active duty positions. Historians still argue whether medieval guards understood the physiological processes involved in cold recovery, or whether they developed effective techniques through practical experience with morning revival requirements. The evidence suggests they achieved sophisticated understanding of recovery needs through observation and experimentation, creating systematic approaches to morning revival that addressed multiple aspects of cold recovery simultaneously. The social aspects of morning revival created important support systems within guard units because individual guards often needed assistance with revival activities that were difficult to perform alone. Guards learned to help each other with equipment preparation, circulation, restoration, and mobility exercises that were more effective when performed with assistance. This mutual support was essential for ensuring that entire guard units achieved operational readiness each morning. The psychological components of morning revival were as important as physical recovery, because guards needed to rebuild confidence and morale that might have been damaged by the previous night's survival ordeal. They developed routines and rituals that helped restore mental readiness, along with physical capability, creating positive momentum that could carry them through another day of challenging duty requirements. You're about to enter the ultimate nightmare scenario that made normal Gatehouse survival look comfortable by comparison. Defending these stone death traps during winter sieges when enemy armies surrounded the castle and guards faced the impossible challenge of maintaining their defensive positions while fighting both human attackers and killing cold simultaneously. This was survival horror where the strategies that kept guards alive during peacetime became impossible luxuries, and where staying warm enough to remain functional meant choosing between thermal survival and military effectiveness in decisions that could determine whether everyone lived or died. Siege conditions transformed every aspect of Gatehouse survival into a deadly compromise between warmth and defense. The fires that provided essential heat during normal winter duty became tactical liabilities that could reveal defensive positions to enemy archers or provide targeting references for siege engines. Guards had to choose between maintaining heating fires that kept them alive and eliminating heat sources that made them visible to attackers who were actively trying to kill them. Many siege chronicles describe the agonizing decisions commanders faced between thermal survival and tactical concealment. The normal sleep rotation systems that allowed guards to survive winter nights became impossible to maintain during active siege conditions. Enemy attacks could come at any hour, requiring all guards to maintain constant readiness, rather than the carefully orchestrated rest schedules that made cold weather survival possible. Guards had to develop techniques for staying warm while remaining at full combat readiness for days or weeks at a time essentially combining the worst aspects of military alertness with the life-threatening challenges of winter survival. Supply line disruption during sieges meant that guards lost access to the fuel, food, and resources that made normal winter survival possible. The carefully planned stockpiles of firewood, warming foods, and winter equipment that sustained guards during peacetime became impossible to replenish when enemy forces controlled all approaches to the castle. Guards had to stretch inadequate supplies over siege periods that could last for months, making every piece of fuel and every warm meal a precious resource that had to be rationed with desperate care. Enemy siege tactics specifically targeted guard thermal survival systems because attacking commanders understood that cold could be as effective as arrows for eliminating defensive capability. Siege engines would target gatehouse chimneys and heating systems, while archers would focus on guards who exposed themselves to tend fires or perform other warming activities. Some attackers used specialized cold weather siege tactics, timing their assaults for the coldest periods when guard effectiveness was naturally reduced by thermal stress. The psychological pressure of siege conditions combined with extreme cold created mental challenges that exceeded anything guards faced during normal winter duty. The constant threat of attack combined with the physical stress of cold exposure and the knowledge that no relief or resupply was possible could break guard morale and effectiveness even when physical survival remained technically possible. Guards had to maintain combat readiness while enduring cold stress that would normally require rest and recovery. Defensive modifications had to account for winter conditions that made normal military preparations inadequate. Arrow loops that provided tactical advantages during warm weather became wind tunnels that could freeze guards at their posts during winter sieges. Murder holes that allowed defenders to attack enemies also became thermal chimneys that stripped precious heat from defensive positions. Guards had to develop temporary modifications that could balance defensive capability with thermal survival. Emergency warming protocols during siege conditions required techniques that could provide thermal support without compromising military effectiveness. Guards developed methods for sharing body heat while maintaining combat readiness, creating warming systems that could be deployed and abandoned quickly based on changing tactical conditions. They learned to use captured enemy equipment for thermal purposes, turning siege warfare materials into improvised heating systems when opportunity allowed. Combat effectiveness suffered dramatically during winter siege conditions because cold-impaired guards couldn't perform military functions at normal efficiency levels. Archers couldn't draw bowstrings with frozen hands. Sword fighters lost grip, strength, and reaction speed, and guards couldn't maintain the alertness necessary for effective defensive duties. Siege commanders had to balance thermal support for guards against tactical requirements that might leave defensive positions undermanned or inadequately protected. The most desperate siege situations led to survival techniques that would have been unthinkable during normal winter duty. Guards might burn furniture, equipment, or even structural elements of the gatehouse itself to maintain heating fires when conventional fuel was exhausted. Some siege chronicles describe guards who removed interior wall stones to create more sheltered sleeping areas, essentially dismantling their own defensive positions to create thermal protection. Historians still argue whether medieval siege tactics deliberately incorporated cold weather warfare techniques, or whether the thermal challenges of winter sieges were simply accepted as unavoidable complications of seasonal military campaigns. The evidence suggests that some commanders understood the tactical advantages of winter sieges that could use cold as a weapon against defending forces, while others may have underestimated the thermal challenges faced by their own attacking forces. Relief strategies for winter sieges had to account for the thermal survival needs of defending guards as well as military supply requirements. Relief forces needed to provide fuel, warm clothing and heating equipment, along with conventional military supplies, because guards who survived siege conditions might be too weakened by cold exposure to continue effective defensive duties without thermal support and recovery time. The casualty rates during winter sieges reflected the combined effects of military action and thermal stress on guard survival. Records suggest that winter siege casualties were significantly higher than either summer siege casualties or winter peacetime guard losses, indicating that the combination of combat stress and cold exposure created survival challenges that exceeded the sum of individual threats. You're about to discover the specific tools, materials, and equipment that separated living gatehouse guards from frozen corpses, because in medieval cold weather, survival having the right gear wasn't about comfort, it was about maintaining the thin margin between life and death that kept guards functional through nights that should have killed them. This was survival technology developed through centuries of trial and error, where each piece of equipment served multiple functions, and guards learned to modify, adapt, and improvise with whatever materials they could acquire or create. The most essential piece of equipment was the brazier, not just any fire container, but specifically designed metal vessels that could provide heat while managing the wind and draft conditions that made gatehouse fires so difficult to maintain. The best braziers had perforated sides that allowed air circulation for combustion while protecting flames from direct wind exposure. Guards learned to position multiple braziers strategically to create overlapping heat zones that could warm larger areas while providing backup heating if individual fires failed. Some guards modified their braziers with improvised windscreens made from metal scraps, leather, or cloth that could be adjusted based on changing air current conditions. Tinder and fire-starting materials became as precious as gold during winter gatehouse duty, because the ability to restart fires quickly could mean the difference between survival and death during emergencies. Guards maintained carefully prepared tinder supplies that could catch sparks even in humid cold conditions. Charred cloth, birch bark, dried moss, or specially treated materials that ignited reliably when other fire-starting methods failed. They carried multiple fire-starting tools, flint and steel sets, char cloth, and backup ignition sources that could function when primary equipment failed or was damaged. Specialized winter clothing modifications distinguished experienced guards from newcomers who relied on standard-issue gear. Veteran guards developed techniques for modifying their clothing to improve thermal performance, adding fur linings to leather equipment, creating layered hood systems that could be adjusted for different weather conditions, and modifying boots with additional insulation materials. They learned to waterproof leather equipment using animal fat beeswax or other treatments that maintained flexibility in freezing temperatures, while preventing moisture penetration that could cause dangerous heat loss. Hot water bottles and primitive heating devices were crafted from available materials to provide portable warmth that could be deployed strategically throughout gatehouse interiors. Guards used leather pouches, clay vessels, or metal containers filled with heated water or warmed stones that could provide hours of localized heating. These improvised heating devices could be moved between sleeping areas, carried during patrol duties, or positioned to warm specific body areas that were most vulnerable to frostbite. Insulation materials were collected, prepared, and deployed with the precision of military engineering, because proper insulation could multiply the effectiveness of limited heat sources. Guards gathered straw hay wool, scraps, animal fur feathers, and any other materials that could trap air and provide thermal barriers between their bodies and cold stone surfaces. They learned to prepare these materials for maximum insulation effectiveness, drying straw, properly cleaning animal fur to maintain loft, and arranging insulation layers to create dead air spaces that provided optimal thermal protection. Tools for thermal management became essential equipment that guards maintained as carefully as weapons or defensive gear. Long-handled implements for managing fires, safely containers for heating and storing warming liquids, and improvised tools for adjusting braziers and heating systems were as important as swords or spears for guard survival. Guards learned to maintain these thermal tools because equipment failure during critical cold periods could prove fatal. Bedding systems were engineered for maximum thermal efficiency, using available materials combined in specific arrangements that experienced guards had perfected through years of winter survival. Multiple layers of straw, wool, fur, and cloth were arranged in precise configurations that created insulation systems capable of retaining body heat throughout entire nights. Guards learned to prepare bedding systems that could be quickly assembled and disassembled based on changing tactical and thermal requirements. Food storage and preparation equipment had to function in freezing conditions, while providing the nutrition necessary for maintaining internal heat generation. Guards used specialized containers that could keep food from freezing solid while remaining accessible during extreme cold. They developed cooking methods that could provide hot meals using minimal fuel while working within the constraints of defensive requirements and limited kitchen facilities. Emergency survival kits contained essential items that could save lives during unexpected thermal crises. These kits included concentrated emergency foods that could provide quick energy for heat generation, emergency fire-starting materials that worked in extreme conditions, basic medical supplies for treating frostbite and cold injuries, and emergency signaling devices that could summon help during hypothermia emergencies. Guards maintained these kits as carefully as they maintained weapons because survival emergencies were as dangerous as military attacks. Historians still argue whether medieval guards had access to standardized survival equipment, or whether they created survival kits through individual initiative and resource acquisition. The evidence suggests that while some essential items might have been provided through military supply systems, much of the specialized survival equipment was acquired, modified, or created by individual guards based on personal experience and local resource availability. Maintenance routines for survival equipment were as important as the equipment itself, because gear failure during extreme conditions could be fatal. Guards learned to inspect, repair, and maintain their thermal survival equipment, systematically ensuring that essential gear remained functional throughout entire winter seasons. They developed techniques for field repairs that could restore equipment functionality using minimal tools and materials. Trading and acquisition networks developed among guards who needed to obtain specialized survival equipment that wasn't available through official supply channels. Guards would trade, barter, or purchase equipment from each other from traveling merchants or from other sources that could provide access to superior survival gear. The most experienced guards developed relationships that could provide access to the best available thermal survival equipment. You're about to uncover the stark reality of how social class determined survival odds in medieval gatehouses, because the difference between being born noble and being born common wasn't just about comfort or status. It was literally the difference between having access to life-saving resources and facing winter duty with inadequate equipment that could mean death by hypothermia. This was survival inequality, where aristocratic guards lived through conditions that killed their common-born comrades, and where understanding these class differences reveals the true brutality of medieval social hierarchy. Noble-born guards arrived at gatehouse duty with advantages that common soldiers couldn't hope to match. They brought personal equipment that had been specifically designed and crafted for cold weather survival, tailored winter clothing made from superior materials, custom-fitted armor that could accommodate multiple clothing layers and personal weapons that had been treated and maintained to function in extreme cold. Noble guards often had access to imported materials like high-quality furs, specialty fabrics, and exotic warming substances that were completely unavailable to common soldiers who relied on whatever standard-issue gear they could obtain. The food disparity was perhaps the most critical survival difference, because nutrition directly affected the body's ability to generate internal heat during extreme cold exposure. Noble guards received better rations that included more fats and proteins essential for cold weather metabolism, while common guards survived on basic provisions that provided minimal thermal support. Noble guards had access to warming foods like imported spices, preserved meats, and specialty drinks that could provide internal heating effect, while their common comrades made do with plain bread, thin porridge, and whatever protein sources were available through standard military supply. Personal servants and retainers created survival support systems that were exclusively available to noble guards. A noble might have a personal attendant who could maintain fires, prepare warming foods, manage equipment, and provide assistance with clothing changes and thermal management activities. This freed noble guards to focus on their military duties while ensuring their thermal needs were professionally managed by dedicated personnel. Common guards had to handle all aspects of their own survival, while simultaneously maintaining military readiness. Access to medical care revealed another layer of class-based survival inequality. Noble guards who developed frostbite hypothermia or cold-related illnesses received immediate attention from trained medical practitioners who understood cold weather injury treatment. Common soldiers with the same injuries might receive basic care from other soldiers with limited medical knowledge, or might be expected to continue duty despite injuries that could become permanently disabling or fatal without proper treatment. The quality of shelter and accommodation created dramatic differences in survival conditions between noble and common guards. Noble guards might be assigned to chambers with better heating systems, superior insulation, or architectural features that provided enhanced protection from wind and cold. They might have access to private spaces that could be heated more efficiently than the common areas where regular soldiers shared quarters. Some noble guards even had access to portable heating devices, improved bedding, or specialized shelter equipment that was unavailable to common guards. Equipment quality represented another crucial advantage that noble guards enjoyed over their common counterparts. Noble guards carried weapons and gear made from superior materials that functioned better in cold conditions, while common guards used standard-issue equipment that might fail when exposed to extreme temperatures. Noble guards could afford regular equipment maintenance and replacement that kept their gear in optimal condition, while common soldiers had to make do with worn or damaged equipment that might compromise their survival capabilities. The social networks available to noble guards created resource access that common soldiers couldn't duplicate. Noble guards could request assistance supplies or equipment through family connections, personal relationships, or social obligations that provided access to resources beyond standard military provisions. They might receive care packages from family members, access to trade networks that could provide superior survival equipment or social support that could help them survive extreme conditions. Training and education advantages meant that noble guards often arrived at gatehouse duty with superior knowledge about cold weather survival techniques. They might have received instruction from experienced tutors, access to written materials about survival methods, or exposure to advanced survival knowledge through their social networks. Common guards typically learned survival techniques through trial and error or informal instruction from other soldiers, often without access to the comprehensive survival education that noble guards received. Resource allocation within gatehouse units reflected social hierarchies that determined who received priority access to limited survival resources. When fuel was scarce, noble guards might receive larger allocations for personal heating. When food supplies were limited, noble guards might receive better rations while common guards faced reduced provisions. These allocation decisions were often presented as military necessity or social obligation, but they directly affected survival odds for guards of different social classes. Historians still argue whether class-based survival advantages were formal military policy or informal practices that developed within individual units. The evidence suggests both some official military regulations acknowledged class differences in accommodation and supply allocation, while other class advantages developed through informal social dynamics within guard units. The psychological advantages of noble status affected survival in subtle but important ways. Noble guards might maintain better morale and confidence because they understood they had superior resources and support systems. They might feel less stress about survival because they knew their social position provided access to assistance that common guards couldn't expect. This psychological advantage could affect decision-making and risk assessment in ways that improved survival odds beyond the material advantages they enjoyed. Emergency assistance was more readily available to noble guards who faced survival crises during extreme cold conditions. A noble guard showing signs of severe hypothermia might receive immediate assistance from multiple personnel, while a common guard with similar symptoms might receive minimal help, because resources had to be reserved for higher status personnel. This differential emergency response could determine whether individual guards survived thermal crises that occurred during gatehouse duty. You're about to understand why the story of medieval gatehouse guards represents something far greater than historical curiosity. It reveals the fundamental human capacity to survive impossible conditions through ingenuity, cooperation, and sheer, stubborn refusal to surrender to forces that should have destroyed them completely. These weren't just soldiers doing their jobs. They were pioneers of human survival science, who developed techniques so effective that modern survival experts still study their methods with genuine respect and admiration. The legacy these guards left behind extends far beyond medieval military history into the realm of human achievement under extreme conditions. Every technique they developed, from communal heating strategies to emergency warming protocols, represented solutions to survival challenges that continue to face humans in extreme environments today. Arctic explorers, mountain climbers, and survival specialists still use variations of medieval techniques that gatehouse guards perfected through centuries of trial and error in conditions that regularly killed unprepared people. The innovation born from desperation created survival technologies that wouldn't be formally understood by science for hundreds of years. Guards who learned to manage airflow, create thermal barriers, and optimize heat retention were essentially developing engineering solutions using medieval materials and methods. They understood principles of thermodynamics, heat transfer, and human physiology through practical application rather than theoretical knowledge, achieving sophisticated understanding through direct experience with life and death consequences. The social cooperation required for gatehouse survival demonstrates humanity's remarkable ability to overcome individual limitations through collective effort and mutual support. Guards learned that survival wasn't an individual achievement, but a community responsibility, where everyone's well-being depended on supporting the weakest members and sharing resources according to need rather than social status. These weren't formal policies but practical wisdom that emerged from understanding that individual survival was impossible without group success. The psychological resilience these guards developed offers insights into human mental capacity under extreme stress that remain relevant for understanding survival psychology today. They learned to maintain hope, human purpose during conditions that could easily have led to despair and surrender. Their techniques for managing fear, isolation, and monotony created psychological survival strategies that modern survival training programs continue to incorporate and study. The technical knowledge that guards accumulated about cold weather survival was passed down through generations of military personnel, eventually contributing to advances in clothing design, heating systems, and architectural techniques that improved human comfort and survival in cold climates. Medieval innovations in layered clothing, portable heating, and wind management influenced developments in military equipment and civilian cold weather gear that continue to benefit people today. The economic impact of guard survival techniques affected medieval society far beyond individual castle defense. Communities that developed superior cold weather survival methods could maintain effective defense during winter months when other regions became vulnerable to attack. This influenced trade routes, military campaigns, and political stability in ways that shaped medieval European development and contributed to the success of civilizations that mastered winter survival techniques. The medical knowledge that emerged from treating cold weather injuries and understanding hypothermia contributed to medieval medical practice and eventually influenced modern understanding of cold weather medicine. Guards who learned to recognize and treat frostbite, hypothermia, and cold-related illnesses developed practical medical knowledge that was shared with physicians and contributed to improvements in cold weather medical care. The architectural lessons learned from gatehouse thermal problems influenced later medieval building design that incorporated better heating systems, wind management, and insulation techniques. Builders learned from the experiences of guards who suffered in poorly designed structures, leading to improvements in military architecture that balanced defensive requirements with human habitability needs. Historians continue to study medieval gatehouse survival techniques because they offer insights into human adaptability, innovation, and resilience that remain relevant for understanding how people respond to extreme challenges. These guards faced conditions that modern technology would consider uninhabitable, yet they found ways not just to survive but to maintain military effectiveness while enduring thermal stress that could have easily killed them. The courage these guards demonstrated wasn't the dramatic heroism of battlefield glory, but the quiet, persistent bravery of people who faced death every night and chose to continue fighting for survival and duty. They understood that their role was essential for protecting their communities, and they found ways to fulfill that responsibility even when the cost was measured in frostbitten fingers, sleepless nights, and constant physical suffering. Modern survival specialists who study medieval gatehouse techniques often express amazement at the sophistication and effectiveness of survival methods developed without modern materials, tools, or scientific understanding. These guards achieved survival success rates that compare favorably to modern survival situations using nothing but medieval technology, practical wisdom, and determined cooperation with their comrades. The story of Gatehouse Guard survival ultimately represents the triumph of human ingenuity over seemingly impossible circumstances, demonstrating that people can find ways to survive and function even in conditions that appear to exceed the limits of human endurance. Their legacy reminds us that survival isn't just about having the right equipment or knowledge, it's about the willingness to keep trying, keep adapting, and keep supporting each other when everything seems hopeless. And so the medieval gatehouse stands in history, not just as a defensive structure, but as a testament to human resilience, where ordinary people achieved extraordinary survival through techniques that saved lives, preserved communities, and demonstrated the remarkable capacity of humans to overcome challenges that should have been insurmountable. Their methods live on, their courage inspires, and their legacy continues to teach us about the depths of human determination when survival itself hangs in the balance. The winter winds still blow through ancient gatehouses across Europe, but they blow through empty chambers now. The braziers have gone cold, the straw bedding has long since rotted away, and the stones have forgotten the warmth of human bodies pressed against them in desperate communion against the cold. Yet somehow, if you listen carefully on the quietest nights, you might still hear the echo of shared breath, the whisper of wool against stone, the soft murmur of guards who refused to let winter claim them without a fight. These weren't legendary heroes whose names appear in chronicles of great battles. They were ordinary people who faced extraordinary challenges with nothing but intelligence, cooperation, and an unshakable determination to see another dawn. They turned survival into an art form, transformed suffering into strength, and proved that human beings can endure almost anything when they refuse to surrender. Walk through those gatehouse ruins today, and you're walking through classrooms where the curriculum was staying alive. Every stone archway frames a lesson in thermal dynamics that guards learned through trial and error. Every arrow loop tells a story about balancing defensive necessity with survival requirements. The murder holes above your head once channeled away precious heat, teaching guards that military architecture and human comfort rarely aligned, and that survival meant adapting to spaces designed to kill rather than shelter. Touch those ancient walls and you're touching surfaces that once radiated deadly cold into chambers where men learned to create warmth from nothing more than shared determination and practical wisdom. These stones witnessed the development of survival techniques so sophisticated that modern specialists study them with genuine admiration. The guards who pressed themselves against these walls during the brutal winters of the 14th and 15th centuries were unknowing pioneers in fields that wouldn't have formal names for centuries: thermal management group psychology, emergency medicine, and human factors engineering. Their innovations rippled through history in ways they never could have imagined. The layered clothing techniques they perfected influenced military uniform design that protected soldiers through 2 world wars. The communal heating strategies they developed informed emergency shelter design that saves lives during modern disasters. The psychological support methods they created for enduring extreme conditions became foundational principles in survival training programs used by astronauts, Arctic researchers, and emergency response teams. Consider the profound democracy of their survival methods, how social hierarchies dissolved when faced with the equalizing force of potentially fatal cold. Noble and common guards alike learned that survival trumped status, that the warmest sleeping spot went to whoever needed it most, not whoever deserved it by birth. In those frozen chambers, humanity's capacity for cooperation and mutual support revealed itself in its purest form, stripped of pretense and focused entirely on the fundamental goal of keeping each other alive. The medical knowledge they accumulated through necessity contributed to our understanding of hypothermia, frostbite treatment, and cold weather physiology. Every technique they developed for recognizing dangerous temperature loss, every method they created for emergency rewarming, every protocol they established for preventing cold-related deaths, added to the accumulated wisdom that modern medical professionals use to save lives in similar conditions. Their story resonates today because it speaks to something timeless in human experience, the reality that life regularly presents us with challenges that seem impossible to overcome, conditions that appear to exceed our capacity for endurance. The Gatehouse guards remind us that survival often depends not on having perfect conditions or ideal resources, but on the willingness to adapt, improvise, and support each other through whatever circumstances we face. In our modern world of climate-controlled environments and instant communication, it's easy to forget how recently humans lived at the mercy of weather, darkness, and cold. The guards who learn to sleep in gatehouse chambers remind us that comfort is a recent innovation, that our ancestors faced conditions we would consider uninhabitable, and that they found ways not just to survive, but to maintain their duties and protect their communities while doing so. The courage they demonstrated wasn't the dramatic bravery of charging into battle, but the quiet, persistent heroism of people who got up every morning and chose to face another day of difficulty, because someone had to stand watch, someone had to maintain the defense, someone had to ensure that civilization continued even when nature seemed determined to freeze it into extinction. Sleep well tonight in your warm bed with your central heating humming softly in the background. But remember, as you drift into comfortable dreams, those who once lay shivering on stone floors and found ways to keep each other alive through the darkest, coldest hours before dawn, their techniques may be history, but their spirit, that quiet, persistent refusal to give up, remains as relevant today as it was 600 years ago. The gatehouse stands empty now, but it stands. The guards are gone, but their legacy endures, and somewhere in the space between sleeping and waking, between warmth and cold, between despair and hope, their story continues to teach us about the remarkable things human beings can accomplish when survival depends on it. Rest easy. The watch has ended, but the lessons remain carried forward by every person who learns that survival isn't about avoiding hardship. It's about finding ways to endure it together, one breath at a time, one heartbeat at a time, one shared moment of warmth at a time. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.